stood on the edge of a challenge to freedom, just as great as Washington confronted in 1776 or Lincoln faced in 1861. Overcoming that challenge required the attention of the entire nation, as the need for a national memorial had to give way to the needs of national survival. Mount Rushmore was never finished, so the Second World War could be fought and won. Now, the story of American involvement in World War II is, like the story of Mount Rushmore, one of individual and collective patriotism. When we consider the individual, we can find so many examples of people from World War II whose patriotism is worthy of the four men immortalized on the mountain behind me. For example, 1775, when word reached the Continental Congress that fighting had broken out in Lexington and Concord, future President John Adams rose to nominate then Colonel George Washington to command the newly formed Continental Army. Washington turned out to be the right man for the job. Through defeat and privation, outnumbered and poorly supplied, he kept his army together and kept the spirit of the revolution alive. His leadership was indispensable to American victory. As World War II broke out, he too was pushed up through the ranks to high command, and like Washington, turned out to be the right man for the job. At Normandy, Eisenhower planned and executed the single largest amphibious operation in history. Then the Supreme Allied Commander personally oversaw the liberation of Western Europe. By the end of World War II, he was one of the highest-ranking men in the United States Army, and like Washington before him, the nation's trust in Eisenhower's wartime leadership eventually led him to the presidency. Now, unlike Washington or Eisenhower, Thomas Jefferson was not a warrior, but he was a statesman, a political philosopher. He was also a musician, an artist, and a scientist, a writer. We can find the patriotism of Thomas Jefferson reflected in so many Americans who did not serve in uniform in World War II, but still found ways to contribute their own unique talents to victory. Filmmaker Walt Disney put his studio to work making training and propaganda films. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb. Industrialist Henry Kaiser invented entirely new methods of shipbuilding. Even Dr. Seuss went to work, creating hundreds of political cartoons designed to bolster morale here at home by lampooning the enemy. Now, as for Abraham Lincoln, he was our first true war president. By the time he assumed office, several southern states had already left the Union, with more to follow. Lincoln rose to the challenge. He crossed party lines, assembling the best minds of the North into a cabinet one historian famously called a team of rivals. Over objections from Congress and even in his own cabinet, he recognized the genius of General Ulysses S. Grant and promoted him to high command. Through the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln elevated the cause of preservation of the Union to the higher cause of freedom. And then on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was struck down by an assassin within days of Union victory, quite literally giving his life for his country. No wartime leader will ever be the equal of Lincoln, but the American who has perhaps come closest is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Already president when World War II broke out, FDR found ways to rearm this country and supply our future allies, even as American public opinion was against further involvement. Then on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, FDR responded by addressing the nation, calling his people to arms by calling the Pearl Harbor attack a date which will live in infamy. After the Gettysburg Address, that infamy speech is probably the best remembered and certainly the most revered oration in American history. Like Lincoln, FDR was a keen judge of character, appointing the right people, including Eisenhower, in the right positions to make a difference. And like Lincoln, FDR lost his life just as the United States grasped victory. Now that is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not to be confused with his distant cousin, President Theodore Roosevelt, who was on the mountain behind me. Now before Teddy Roosevelt was president, most Americans knew of him as a soldier. When the Spanish-American War broke out, Theodore Roosevelt recruited his own volunteer fighting force. Known as the Rough Riders, they were a mix of East Coast athletes and cowboys from right here in the Old West. On July 1st, 1898, Roosevelt personally led his Rough Riders uphill in a charge against a fortified enemy position we remember as San Juan Hill. For his heroism that day, he received the Medal of Honor and the fame that eventually led him to the presidency. Now, 46 years after American troops stormed San Juan Hill, another generation of young Americans stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. And the very first senior officer to set foot ashore was also named Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., eldest son of the former president, was 56 years old by this point and riddled with crippling arthritis. but as assistant division commander, it was his job to lead his men ashore. As he waded up through the surf, leaning on his cane for support, he realized that the confusion of the battle, his men had been deposited on the wrong beach. Undaunted, he called his senior officers together, told them, "Gentlemen, we will start the war from right here," and send them inland to ultimate victory. Unfortunately, he did not live to see it. A little over a month later, he lost his life to a heart attack, likely caused by his exertion on that beach and in the campaign that followed. Like his father, he too received the Medal of Honor. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are just a few examples of World War II patriotism worthy of the four men on Mount Rushmore. But let's not forget, Mount Rushmore isn't just about the individual, but also collective patriotism. And here, too, we find the World War II generation more than live up to the example of the generations immortalized by this mountain. Throughout the Second World War, 16 million Americans served in uniform. They came from many different backgrounds, races, and creeds, but fought side by side on almost every continent and in every ocean. Meanwhile, back at home, tens of millions more Americans worked on the home front. They harvested raw materials, manufactured supplies and equipment, maintained infrastructure, generally doing all the things necessary to keep our troops supplied and this nation working toward victory. Then when it all ended in 1945, the vast majority of those who worked and those who served got a chance to come home and enjoy in peace what they won in war. Today we remember them as our greatest generation because in many ways they built the modern world. But it's important to remember that not everyone came home. And perhaps that is where we find collective patriotism at its deepest. After the Civil War, World War II was the deadliest conflict in our nation's history. More than 400,000 Americans lost their lives. Now for the Civil War, the places Americans we most intimately associate with remembering those who gave their lives is of course Gettysburg. Site not only of the war's largest and most important battle, but the place for that reason Abraham Lincoln chose to give the Gettysburg Address, probably the most important speech in our history. Now for the Second World War, there are two places, two battlefield cemeteries that hold a similar level of significance to Gettysburg. One of them is the wreck of the battleship Arizona. Sunk by the Japanese on December 7, 1941 during the Pearl Harbor attack, Arizona went down in a matter of minutes with the vast majority of her crew still aboard. Now in the years that followed, as the Second World War continued, the other ships sunk around Arizona. Some were refloated and rebuilt, others were broken up for scrap, but Arizona's wreck remained in place, serving as a very powerful, very poignant reminder to Americans of exactly what it was we were fighting for. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been 80 years, and Arizona still rests in that exact same spot. Preserved and protected by the National Park Service, she is the final resting place of more than 1,177 U.S. Navy sailors and Marines who made the supreme sacrifice and gave their lives for their country. Now, on the other side of the world, on a bluff overlooking Normandy Beach, 5,000 more Americans rest side by side. Most of them lost their lives on the beach below or in the campaign that followed. Among them are two sons of Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who died in the Normandy campaign, and his little brother, Quentin Roosevelt. Quentin was a fighter pilot, World War I, killed in action, shot down over France, whose remains were later moved to Normandy, so these two brothers, these two sons of Theodore Roosevelt, could rest side by side. Now at Gettysburg, Lincoln defined the cause so many Union soldiers have fought and died for as what he called in the Gettysburg Address a new birth of freedom. At Normandy, the words of a general named Mark Clark are carved in marble in the Visitor Center, similarly defining what he believed so many Americans of his own generation had fought and died for in World War II. Quote, "If ever proof were needed that we fought for a cause and not for conquest, it could be found here in these cemeteries. Here was our only conquest. All we asked was enough soil in which to bury our gallant dead." In a little while, I'm going to turn on the lights and illuminate Mount Rushmore. As you look at the breathtaking sculpture above us, please contemplate the patriotism of the four men carved in stone. Please celebrate the patriotism of the generations of Americans who founded, expanded, preserved, and developed this country across those first 150 years. But as you continue to look at the mountain, as you notice where the sculpted surface gives way to naturally weathered stone, as you note the work on Mount Rushmore that was never finished, consider that perhaps that too is a memorial to a generation of Americans who had no choice but to stop carving this mountain so they could protect and defend everything that Mount Rushmore stands for. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and never forget.
The United States of America. It's hard to imagine, but not long ago, this great land of ours was pure wilderness. A place where millions of bison roamed freely throughout the plains. And those who lived off the land revered it as sacred ground. Yet this country would face a dramatic change, quickly becoming the most advanced nation in the world, in technology, in peace, and in power. From its inception, the United States has shaped itself under the guidance of strong leaders, leaders who have taken risks, stood up to adversity, and never let go of their vision for a better country. Mount Rushmore reminds us of them, and the countless Americans who have made great sacrifices to ensure the lasting legacy of our country. Freedom. We strived for it, we died for it, we live for it. The year was 1923. The place, the Black Hills of South Dakota. State historian Don Robinson proposed that these granite outcroppings could be the site of an enormous monument dedicated to the heroes of the West, such as Lewis and Clark and Chief Red Cloud. But commissioned sculptor Gutzon Borglum had a different concept in mind. Borglum was a passionately patriotic man, and believed that a more fitting tribute should honor the American experience. A memorial that would represent our ideals, our dreams, and our accomplishments as a country. A memorial that would convey a spirit of patriotism. Borglum chose his canvas carefully. The giant granite rock face of Mount Rushmore. And in 1927, work on the mountain began. Borglum assembled a team of local miners, ranchers, and lumbermen to help with construction. The sculptor built a model of the presidency to serve as a guide. Every inch on the model represented 1 foot on the mountain. Year after year, Borglum and his crew hung perilously off the side of the mountain, drilling and blasting their way to reach granite solid enough for carving. It took 14 years and nearly $1 million to complete the 4 60-foot faces. And even though the sculptor did not live to see the very final touches put into place, he was able to carry out his vision. 4 great Americans immortalized in stone, symbolizing the democratic society in which we live, the struggle for our independence, the fight for our freedom, and the sacrifices we have made since our country began more than 200 years ago. It was a time of rebellion and of war. It began as an uprising against British rule and turned into a full-fledged crusade for personal freedom and national independence. The American Revolution. From 1775 to 1783, up to 250,000 patriots engaged in battle. Even during the toughest times, when the Continental Army seemed undisciplined and ill-equipped, one man's courage and determination ultimately led the troops to victory over the British. The future father of our country, George Washington. Born and raised in colonial Virginia, George Washington grew up to be a firm believer in American independence. Even though his heart yearned for quiet family life at his Mount Vernon home, his deep commitment to the Republic made him answer the call of his country time and time again. As general, Washington became an instant hero throughout the colonies. The public was so enamored with him that many people wished that he become king. But Washington scoffed at such an idea.
The army must serve the country, but not rule it. Express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes to overturn the liberties of our country. George Washington, 1783.
It was this kind of insight and integrity that made him the perfect person to oversee the creation of a new federal government. With no blueprint to follow, Washington kept the colonies united and on course during the infant years of this nation. And after ratification of the Constitution, when he was unanimously elected first President of the United States, Washington was keenly aware that he was laying down the framework for future presidents to follow. Washington's legacy is that of a man who was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. In his inaugural address, he spoke of the task that lay before this new nation.
The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked, on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. George Washington, 1789.
George Washington welded this union, but it would take another great visionary to expand it. Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson, 1776.
Thomas Jefferson was the voice of the American people, inspiring patriots with his carefully crafted words written in the Declaration of Independence, the document that gave birth to our nation. It was also Jefferson who fought for religious freedom and the democratic notion that people should have a say in government, two very American principles we cherish today. Thomas Jefferson always thought of himself more as a scientist or scholar than as a politician. And it was this quest for knowledge that played a role in the greatest achievement of his presidency. In 1803, Jefferson acquired the French lands west of the Mississippi in the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the country. In an effort to find out what America now owned, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their famous expedition out west. It was an exciting time of discovery for new Americans. However, what was good for a growing nation was not necessarily good for its original inhabitants. During this time of expansion, many Native Americans were uprooted from their homes and hunting grounds and pushed farther west. But during an address to a group of Cherokee chiefs, Jefferson prophesied about future relations between natives and new settlers.
I shall rejoice to see the day when the red men, our neighbors, become truly one people with us, enjoying all the rights and privileges we do, and living in peace and plenty as we do, without anyone to make them afraid, to injure their persons, or to take their property, without being punished for it according to fixed laws. Thomas Jefferson, 1808.
Jefferson's dream was slow to be realized as conflicts between the U.S. government and Native Americans set off a chain of events that dramatically reduced Native populations throughout the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson believed in the promise of America and had faith in the American people. But this faith would truly be tested nearly 60 years later, when the Republic came dangerously close to unraveling. The Civil War was the most tumultuous period in American history. The differences between the states had deeply divided a nation, pitting brother against brother on American soil. But it was the determination of one man to keep the United States united. Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president. Abraham Lincoln was a self-made man of great character, a frontiersman who came from humble beginnings. When Lincoln was inaugurated in 1861, he faced more adversity than any other president in U.S. history. Many southern states had withdrawn from the Union. And even though Lincoln opposed war, he warned the South in his inaugural address that he would take whatever measures necessary to stop the rebellion.
In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one, to preserve, protect, and defend it. Abraham Lincoln, 1861.
The Civil War raged on for 4 brutal years. But Lincoln stuck to his commitment to democracy. His main objective was to save the Union, and he also strongly believed in freedom for all Americans. Until slavery was abolished, Lincoln felt the U.S. could never truly be the home of the free. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation began the process that ended the evils of slavery forever. Over 500,000 Union and Confederate soldiers lost their lives in the Civil War. But during his famous Gettysburg Address, Lincoln reminded the American people what this war was really all about.
That we here highly resolve that these dead should not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, 1863.
Over the next 50 years, the United States would go through a dramatic transformation. The year 1900 was coming around the bend, and America was turning from a rural republic to a budding industrial power. It was clear that this new century, which burst with hope, needed a fresh start and a fresh approach. It was Theodore Roosevelt, our 26th president, who led the way.
Is America a weakling To shrink from the work of the great world powers? No! The young giant of the West stands on a continent and clasps the crest of an ocean in either hand. Our nation, glorious in youth and strength, looks into the future with eager eyes and rejoices as a strong man to run a race. Theodore Roosevelt, 1897.
He was energetic, he was robust, and he was eager to show the world that America was a force to be reckoned with. Theodore Roosevelt believed in the strenuous life. Frail and sickly as a young boy, he overcame his illnesses and grew up to be a naturalist, a cowboy, a war hero, an author, and President of the United States by the young age of 42. His vigorous outlook on life transferred to the Oval Office. Roosevelt was a man of action. He promoted economic freedom and was a friend to the working class, protecting their rights against big business and what he called the criminal rich. Roosevelt also expanded the country's power abroad. It was his support of the 1903 revolution in Panama that led the U.S. to acquire territory for the construction of the Panama Canal. This massive undertaking not only created a valuable link between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but it put the United States on the map in world politics. Yet, Roosevelt may be known best for his passion for the outdoors. He was vocal about conservation, and through the power of his presidency, he provided federal protection for almost 230 million acres of land.
To waste, to destroy our natural resources, to skin and exhaust the land instead of using it so as to increase its usefulness, will result in undermining in the days of our children the very prosperity which we ought by right to hand down to them, amplified and developed. Theodore Roosevelt, 1907.
The pursuit of the American dream did not end with Theodore Roosevelt's term. Instead, it has carried us into the 21st century. Throughout history, countless Americans have made great sacrifices so that we can enjoy the freedoms of this land.
The only thing we have to fear, I have a dream today. Ask not what your country can do for you.
The same freedoms guaranteed in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. The same freedoms millions of people have sought since the first immigrants arrived over 200 years ago. Gutzon Borglum reminds us of this with his timeless memorial. 4 Americans representing the birth, growth, preservation, and development of this country. All embodying the spirit of our nation. All advocates of freedom, dignity, and the ideals of American life.
Oh.